June 1942. In the vast, endless blue of the Pacific Ocean, the fate of the United States, and perhaps the direction of the entire Second World War, balanced on a knife's edge. For months, America had been pushed back, beaten, bruised, and humiliated. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins. The Philippines had fallen. The enemy seemed unstoppable, its momentum a tidal wave sweeping across the Pacific. Many believed the Japanese Navy was simply too powerful, too precise, too disciplined to be defeated. Yet on a remote speck of coral called Midway, destiny quietly waited, preparing to shift. Not through overwhelming strength, but through intelligence, courage, and the desperate resolve of young men who understood that survival was far from guaranteed. Midway did not begin with roaring engines or screaming dive bombers. It began in dimly lit rooms, with tired eyes staring at strings of intercepted code. American cryptanalysts, working day and night, had done what seemed impossible. They had broken the Japanese naval code. They knew the enemy's next objective. They knew the day, the hour, the direction of attack. With this silent victory, America moved from prey to ambusher. On the deck of the USS Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance stood over a map of the Pacific, tracing the invisible path of the approaching Japanese fleet. His finger paused over a point in the ocean, Midway. "They will come," he said quietly, "and when they come, we'll be waiting." While officers planned, ordinary men prepared in their own way. On the ground at Midway, in sand-blown hangars battered by salt and wind, pilots inspected their aging aircraft. Among them was a young man named Jack Reynolds, barely into his 20s, wiping the dust from the gun sight of his Douglas SBD Dauntless. The Dauntless was slow, outdated, and fragile. Its frame rattled in turbulence, and its speed was dwarfed by the sleek, deadly Japanese Zeros. Jack moved with a careful, almost reverent touch. His hand trembled, not from the cold dawn air, but from an unspoken fear. "Tomorrow," he whispered to himself, "might be my last." His friend Marty approached, a crooked grin on his face as he tightened the strap on his sidearm. "You know what's funny, Jack?" he said. "We're flying the slowest damn plane in the Pacific, and tomorrow we're supposed to take on the best pilots Japan's got." The two shared a soft laugh, the kind men make to keep their fear from showing.
Don't let the chief hear you say that.
The weight of what lay ahead pressed down on them both, but neither spoke of it. Instead, they returned to their tasks, each motion a small rebellion against the dread of morning. Far across the water, aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, the sun rose over a scene of flawless discipline. Deck crews rolled bombs and torpedoes across polished steel. Planes were fueled, armed, and positioned in perfect formation. The Japanese Navy moved with the confidence of victors. For months, their rise had been meteoric. Their pilots were experienced, their equipment cutting edge, their leadership decisive. But in their efficiency, a subtle, deadly mistake began to unfold. Bombs and torpedoes, weapons meant for entirely different targets, were stored together on the hangar decks, waiting for a final decision. No one knew it yet, but these moments of preparation were laying the groundwork for disaster. At 5:50 a.m. on June 4th, the first act of the battle erupted. American planes stationed on Midway scrambled into the air, their engines coughing and sputtering as they climbed into the morning sky. These pilots knew what they were flying into. They had seen the size of the Japanese fleet. They understood the odds. But they went anyway. Courage sometimes means ignoring the math. The attack was brutal and brief. Waves of American aircraft, B-26, TBF Avengers, and Marine Corps dive bombers hurled themselves at the Japanese fleet. They were met by a storm of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of Zero fighters. Planes were ripped apart mid-air, torn to pieces by cannon shells. One bomber, engulfed in flames, refused to break off. The pilot, dying but determined, aimed directly at the carrier Akagi, pulling up only in the final seconds before smashing into the sea. None of these attacks hit a target. Not a single bomb found its mark. But they achieved something far more important. They forced the Japanese to react. They pulled the enemy's fighters down to sea level, and they delayed the crucial decision about which weapons should remain armed on the carriers. Time, the most precious commodity, was slipping away from the Japanese. Meanwhile, aboard the Enterprise and the Yorktown, American pilots waited tensely in their cockpits as their carriers turned into the wind. Engines roared to life, propellers churned the morning air, and one by one, the Dauntless dive bombers climbed skyward. The pilots had no radar guidance, no precise coordinates, only a rough guess. They searched endlessly, scanning empty horizons, fighting growing fatigue and rising doubt. Hours seemed to pass. Hope began to fade. For Jack Reynolds and his fellow pilots, the Pacific felt infinite. Clouds drifted like ghostly curtains. The radio crackled with static. Fuel gauges sank lower and lower. Just when despair threatened to overtake them, a glimmer of hope appeared. Far in the distance, black dots on the shining blue surface. Ships. Many ships. The Japanese fleet. But fate is rarely generous. Before the dive bombers could strike, the slow, vulnerable American torpedo squadrons, flying obsolete TBD Devastators, reached the Japanese carriers first. They flew barely above wavetop, painfully slow, turning themselves into perfect targets. One by one, they were shot down. Machine gun tracers stitched through fuselages. Wings tore away. Men died in burning spirals that vanished beneath the sea. Of Torpedo Squadron 8, out of 16 planes, 15 were destroyed. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived, clinging to a life raft as the battle raged around him. Their attack did not score a single hit, but they achieved the impossible. They dragged the Japanese fighters down to low altitude, leaving the sky above unguarded. At that precise moment, as if history waited for the perfect breath, the Dauntless dive bombers arrived high above the Japanese fleet. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Sōryū lay below, their decks cluttered with fueled planes and armed munitions. Pilots looked down through their bomb sights and saw chaos. Crews running, planes turning, torpedoes glinting in the sun. Admiral Nagumo was moments away from launching a decisive strike that would annihilate the American carriers. Moments, and then the moment was gone. Spruance's dive bombers rolled over into their dives. Jack Reynolds pushed his Dauntless forward, the nose dropping into a near-vertical plunge. The wind shrieked past the canopy. The altimeter spun downward, and the carrier Kaga filled his view like a target painted by fate. Anti-aircraft bursts flashed around him, shrapnel tapping against the wings. Jack forced himself to breathe steadily, holding the bomb sight steady on a cluster of planes parked on the flight deck. At 2,000 feet, he pulled the release. The bomb detached with a heavy jolt, falling gracefully, almost calmly, toward the ship below. Jack yanked back the stick, his vision blurring with the strain as the Dauntless screamed back toward the sky. His bomb, and dozens of others, struck home. Explosions tore through the Japanese carriers. Flames shot upward, fed by gasoline, torpedoes, and rows of fully armed aircraft. The fire spread with terrifying speed, consuming steel and flesh alike. In minutes, 3 of Japan's mighty carriers were mortally wounded. The air was filled with smoke, fire, and the twisting silhouettes of men running, falling, or leaping into the sea. Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, all burning, all doomed. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered a blow it could not hide, could not soften, could not undo. And the tide of the Pacific began to turn. Yet the battle was far from over. The Japanese carrier Hiryū, still intact, launched its own counterstrike and found the American carrier Yorktown. The attack was skillful, fierce, and devastating. Yorktown was bombed, torpedoed, set aflame, yet somehow her crew kept her afloat. The Japanese struck again and again. Finally, she succumbed. Yorktown's death was slow, honorable, and painful. Her sailors evacuated her in silence, watching their proud ship list and groan as the sea claimed her. But Hiryū's triumph was short-lived. American dive bombers located her that afternoon, repeating the deadly choreography of the morning. Bombs slammed into her decks, engulfing her in fire. By nightfall, Hiryū was mortally damaged. With her loss, all 4 Japanese carriers committed to the Midway operation were gone. Darkness settled over the Pacific. The surviving American pilots struggled to return to their carriers, many nearly out of fuel, some wounded, some praying simply to see the deck lights of their floating home. Jack Reynolds limped back with holes in his wings, oil streaking the canopy, and exhaustion weighing like iron on his arms. When he finally touched down on the Enterprise, he felt his body shudder. Not from impact, but from the realization that he was still alive. Midway was not just a victory, it was a resurrection. A moment when the tide of war stopped flowing one way and began to reverse. A moment when ordinary men, flying outdated aircraft, fighting impossible odds, and fueled by little more than courage, changed the course of history. The Japanese Navy, once invincible, had lost irreplaceable ships, irreplaceable pilots, irreplaceable momentum. America, battered but unbroken, had struck its first great blow. In the decades since, historians have studied the strategies and decisions, the codes broken, and the mistakes made. But the heart of Midway does not lie in charts or theories. It lies in the men, the torpedo squadrons who flew into certain death, the dive bomber pilots who arrived at the exact second fate allowed, the sailors who kept their carriers afloat under fire, and the young Americans who accepted that sacrifice might be their only contribution to victory. Midway reminds us that history can hinge on moments so fragile they almost slip away. Moments when the courage of a few shapes the destiny of millions. Moments when the tide turns, not gradually, but all at once. And in June 1942, in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth, the tide of the Pacific War turned in favor of the United States. Because a handful of men dared to fly into the fire, even when the world believed they could not win. If this story moved you, honor the bravery of those who fought at Midway. Like, share, and subscribe, so their courage is never forgotten.